What I'm going to talk about today is experimental and still a little bit vague, though I hope it will make just enough sense for you to gauge some kind of vaguely tangible thesis emerging. And a lot of the work I've done on affect and feeling and so forth has concerned what we might call sort of atypical or under-theorized states, in particular what I christened existential feelings. And for a long time I thought that your standard occurrent episodic emotions were a bit boring. It's just a matter of world-directed feeling with a dose of other stuff thrown on top. And just recently I've changed my mind, so I'm today going to talk about more familiar types of emotion. And the topic of this paper has emerged from the collision of two research themes, some work I've been doing on emotion regulation and some work I've been doing on grief. And what I want to try and do today is categorize something that I think is central to emotional experience, or, and this is important, to many forms of emotional experience. The scope of my claims is yet to be determined. And it is something that philosophers have neglected, or if they haven't neglected it, perhaps you can tell me. So I'm going to refer to this as the two-sided structure of emotional intentionality. And what I mean by that will hopefully become progressively clearer as I proceed. And I'm going to at least float the idea that a distinctive two-sided structure is what singles out emotional intentionality. It's what distinguishes emotional intentionality from other forms. And I should also mention the final version of this paper is very likely to be co-authored with my colleague Lena Ryberg-Ingerslev, though what I'm going to address today is drawn from my own work. So let me just set the scene first of all. It's fairly uncontroversial to maintain that some or all emotions are intentionally directed, and furthermore that they're directed at states beyond the body. So I'm afraid of the raging bull stomping in my direction, for example. And a lot of the debate is concerned not whether emotions are intentional states, but what emotional intentionality consists of. So according to one approach, emotional intentionality is a composite of more familiar kinds of intentionality. To cook up an emotion, you fry up a bit of belief, throw in some desire, maybe a bit of feeling, where feeling is construed as an intentional state directed at one's own body, shove in evaluative judgments, what are they, maybe throw in a bit of narrative if you feel up to it, and so on. And contrary to this view, others have argued that emotions involve a sui generis form of intentionality. There's something distinctive about emotional intentionality. And I'm going to adopt what I think is a version of this latter view. Now, I'm going to assume from the very beginning that a contrast between the world-directed intentionality of emotion and emotional feeling is misplaced. Many bodily feelings are at the same time directed at things beyond the body. We might say it's through the feeling body that we experience the world emotionally. And quite a lot of philosophers have converged on this view recently. I've tried to make a case for it by, for example, comparing emotional feeling to tactual feeling. When I touch this lectern, it's through my feeling body that I perceive something external to it. And indeed, through touch, we can experience things that are some distance from us. When you touch using a tool, for example. So I reject distinctions between, if you like, the evaluative judgment aspect of emotion and the feeling dimension. And I'm beginning to think that people have won that argument. Lots of us have argued for a similar position, and I haven't seen any comebacks yet that look convincing to me. But then I got disappointed because I came to the conclusion that the whole debate was something of a distraction. I mean, for one thing, there's the question of whether it's a largely verbal dispute. So if you want to characterize emotions in terms of judgments, you need a conception of judgment that's so permissive it accommodates what other philosophers call feelings, and vice versa. But whatever you end up with, including what I used to be comfortable with, you get something that is at best necessary for a current or episodic emotion. It's clearly not sufficient. So, in short, every experience of every situation involves evaluations of a kind that you could characterize in terms of world-directed feeling, evaluative judgment, effectively charged perception. Take your pick, whichever is your favourite, I don't care. For instance, in writing an academic paper, my computer, my keyboard, my notes all appear significant to me in various ways. They're experienced as significant, but unless I've wolfed down a Starbucks venti Americano that morning and then proceeded to deal with 40 particularly irritating emails, I'm not going to be in an overtly emotional state. And what I'm interested in are the kinds of emotional states that you can contrast with more mundane experiences. What distinguishes a specifically emotional experience from experience more generally? And I just don't think you can get that by appealing to judgments, feelings, or whatever. What you get is too permissive. And what I want to consider are two additional features of emotional experience, and I'm going to stick them together and hopefully say something vaguely new. So I want to look, first of all, at the way in which an emotion relates to a wider network of cares, concerns, values, and commitments. And I want to blend that with the dynamic structure of emotion as well. I think emotional experience, and I should say I am focusing specifically on human emotional experience rather than just emotion per se. I think what we have to do is emphasize the dynamism here. So what I'm going to claim, and here's, as is traditional in philosophy, I'm going to reveal the plot before I get going. I'm going to suggest that emotional intentionality has a distinctive two-sided structure. So when you experience something in an emotional way, when you see that raging bull heading towards you and experience it as frightening, the experience has a distinctive structure. When you experience the bull, the emotion also includes a potential or actual disturbance of the wider experiential world within which that object of emotion is encountered. So you've got a localized emotional experience of something, and inextricable from that is something much more diffuse and pervasive and hard to pin down. And in addition to this, I want to emphasize that there's a kind of dynamism involving a sort of tension between the localized object of emotion and the context within which it's encountered. In particular, a localized object of emotion can destabilize a context through which that very object is experienced and understood. Phenomenologically, I have an emotional experience of something in the context of a world, a realm that I find myself in. And yet, that experience somehow and to some degree destabilizes the wider context. So as a result, emotions are riddled with tensions. Now, I should say my strategy here is going to be to focus on certain emotions that you would regard as strong, especially pronounced, and also deep, where I think this structure is most salient and where my claims are most plausible. And then what I'm going to try and do is tiptoe outside that, as it were, and suggest that maybe we can generalize. Maybe we can push this further. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is address some themes in the work of other philosophers that we can stick together to get some way towards this point. Now, there's a general consensus in philosophy that when we experience something emotionally, we detect its value or significance, its practical meaning, how it matters, its importance to us. And generally, it's assumed that such properties are somehow experienced, which doesn't imply the more specific claim that they are experienced perceptually. Furthermore, certain evaluative properties are experienced as integral to the object of emotion. It is the rampaging bull that appears frightening. it is the film that appears exciting, unless it's The Last Jedi. But this, sorry about that, I couldn't hold back. Have to express my disappointment somehow, even though this isn't an appropriate forum. This might give the impression that emotional ways of experiencing things are localized. You have a particular entity within the world appears to have certain evaluative properties. The emotion concerns the bull, it's an experience of the bull. The emotion is quarantined. But it should also be emphasized that this aspect of the experience is relational. How something matters to me, whether it appears frightening or exciting or alarming or saddening, is symptomatic of a wider set of cares and concerns that I already have. So the fact that I'm afraid of the bull reflects pre-existent concerns for my survival, a dislike for experiencing excruciating pain and being stamped upon. And what I'd like to do is distinguish three aspects of emotional experience generally. You have the experienced object of an emotion. I'm talking about the bull as it is experienced. And sorry to use the standard corny example, I couldn't be bothered with anything more elaborate, so I'll stick with being afraid of the bull. Then also you have the emotional attitude towards that object. So you're fearing something and it appears frightening, it looks threatening. But then in addition to that, we've got to acknowledge the background of cares and concerns in virtue of which one has an attitude of that type towards that object. Now, what I want to ask is, how should we characterize C, these cares and concerns? What are they? How, if at all, do they enter into an emotional experience? And how do they relate to the concrete object of emotion? And there have been all sorts of attempts to address such questions, at least in part. And one of the most developed accounts is that of Bennett Helm in various writings. So he distinguishes between the target of the emotion, what I'm calling the object here, and then the formal object, which would be, in the case of the bull, threat, and what he calls the focus. And it's the focus that's of interest for me. So the target of the emotion is the raging bull charging in my direction. The formal object is threat. But what's the focus? Well, Helm describes emotions as intentional feelings of import. Like me, he wouldn't distinguish the intentionality of emotion from the feeling dimension. And by the import of something, he means the way in which the object of emotion impacts, potentially or actually, on one's pre-established values. It's only in the light of those values that the object does, or at least should, appear to have certain evaluative properties. So I value my life, the bull appears threatening. And this is what Helm means by the focus, the pre-established values. Also of interest is he emphasizes that this implies a holistic aspect to emotion and more particularly focus. So a given focus, such as valuing my life, implies a coherent range of emotional responses. If I value something, then I ought to fear something else, and I ought to experience relief when something else happens, and so on. It's not just what we do experience, there's a normative pattern to this. And importantly as well, he says that the focus of an emotion is holistic. We don't just have isolated concerns. So my concern for my children isn't something that's completely separate from my working life, insulated, quarantined. It permeates every aspect of my existence in a structured, cohesive way. But we find these themes all over the place in the philosophical literature on emotion, and they're addressed in various ways. It's common to refer to a background of concern. So a well-known paper by Robert Roberts suggests that emotions are concern-based construals of objects and situations. Other people put this in different ways, though. Martha Nussbaum writes, emotions reveal how things are salient to our well-being. Something isn't just salient, it's salient to a context, to our well-being. Benzev here puts it in a slightly different way. He says registering something emotionally involves relating it to a certain background framework. And then most recently here, and I think closest to my own view, is Gerrit Klaas. Sorry, I have terrible problems pronouncing Dutch names. And he refers also to the double intentionality of emotions. And the way he puts it is that they're directed at concrete objects and simultaneously at the self. They're self-referential in ways that we don't always have insight into. So the way in which you experience something emotionally reveals something about you. It reveals something about your values and your concerns. Okay, so the first thing I want to emphasize is that this focus or self-referential aspect of emotion isn't just something that's partly responsible for generating the emotion. It's also an important constituent of the emotional experience. And it's experienced neither as an internal state of oneself or as an evaluative property adhering to some thing or situation in a pre-given world. Rather, this focus, this background, is integral to the experiential world that we ordinarily take for granted as a backdrop to our various experiences, thoughts, and activities. And I'll try and spell that out a bit more clearly. So, emotions involve both a specifically focused intentionality, but inseparable from that, a kind of background that envelops the world more widely. But what I also want to chuck into the mix here is a second aspect. To understand the relationship between the background and the foreground, the focus and the target, we also have to emphasize the dynamic structure of emotion, and in a way that shouldn't simply be contrasted with rational thought. And again, Martha Nussbaum is very good on this. She talks about how an emotion is an intelligent process. Emotional rationality moves and embraces and refuses. And when we're looking at strong, occurrent emotions, the upheaval that they involve isn't opposed to reason. It is a process of recognition, a way of engaging in and making sense of one's situation. We can also add to this that many human emotions, at least, are not short episodes, regardless of how many neurobiologists and others you might read. Certain emotions are stretched out. They involve longer-term processes. And this is something Peter Goldie really wanted to emphasize in his final works. You take an emotion such as guilt or grief. It's essentially stretched out in time. Furthermore, its nature is what holds it together, if you like, isn't some feeling that persists through all of it. Somehow you have a cohesive temporal pattern, even though none of the same constituents present at time one need be present at time two. So I want to bring these two themes together and suggest that we can identify what is distinctive about certain forms of characteristically emotional intentionality. And the answer, I suggest, is that there's a dynamic, a kind of experienced interaction going on between the focus and the concrete object of emotion. In short, the object is experienced through a pre-given evaluative framework. But what we have to add is, to some degree and in some way, however subtle, however pronounced, however localized or wide-ranging, it also destabilizes that same framework. So there's a kind of tension. You experience something against a backdrop, but it says at the same time, the backdrop against which you encounter me is no longer tenable. So there's a kind of tension here. And what you can get sometimes is a circular process of varying subtlety, complexity, and duration, whereby the object progressively undermines the structure through which it is evaluated, in a manner that then feeds into one's ongoing engagement with the intentional object of the emotion. So, and what I also want to reiterate is that the backdrop, this background that I refer to a localized emotional evaluation, is not experienced principally as a state of oneself or as a state of a situation in an already established world. For the most part, it's etched into the world, into a realm that we already find ourselves dropped in when we think about this, evaluate that, believe that this, or feel that. So, I suppose the way I'm thinking of this is the world that we take for granted in our everyday activities is rather like a forest with all sorts of intersecting trails that we habitually follow. And our patterns of thinking, what we say, I suppose even I would say our grasp of certain concepts, our activities presuppose these trails that we've habitually sown into the world. Even our perceptual experiences involve configuring the world in these terms. But these trails and their integrity presuppose various concerns. Certain habitual ways of seeing things, thinking and acting are only intelligible, only make sense given certain concerns. So I take it for granted that I'm dropped into this room before an audience trying to interest you with some claims about emotion. I take a certain context as given when perhaps I feel maybe I didn't make that point very well and worry about that, or maybe someone looks a bit bored over there, that's not great. There's something that I already take as given. But of course this context, what I take for granted as practically salient and what disappears into the background like that rather dark picture up there. This reflects pre-given concerns. So it's only in the context of being a philosophy professor committed to certain things, committed to regarding certain things as worthwhile, that what I'm doing now even makes sense. If the only thing I cared about in the world was watching The Walking Dead, if I cared about nothing more, this performance wouldn't make sense. It presupposes a sort of variably coherent framework of cares and concerns that are habitually etched into my ways of acting, thinking, and perceiving. But of course, those concerns are hostage to some extent to changes in the world. If I'm dismissed from my job and can't find another one, this is going to change various cares and concerns in a way that impacts on the meaningfulness of my practices. So this is how I'm thinking of the world. And if you don't like the term experiential world, pick something else. But I hope that at least gives you a sense of what I'm thinking about here. A background structure that we take for granted that is quite diffuse, not clearly bounded, and this interacts in various ways with the explicit object of emotion. So, how are we to understand this dynamic? Well, let me focus on one specific example and see if I can get this across. And when I think through this, sometimes it works, and sometimes it all falls to pieces. So I'll see what happens now. But the example I'd like to focus on is grief, which is a topic I've been working on for a while. So when I was writing an earlier paper on the topic of grief, I was struck by this first statement here from an autobiographical account of grief by Joyce Carol Oates, and that's a typo there. So she writes how following the death of her husband, she's driving back from the hospital with his various possessions. And then she remarks, strange to consider that there would be a home now without my husband, a home to which to take his belongings. There's a kind of bemusement here, a kind of tension. What does it consist of? Well, I think it is clear, as I've already indicated, that grief can involve a profound, pervasive and prolonged disturbance of one's life. And again, here's Martha Nussbaum, and reflecting on her own grief following the death of her mother. It's an upheaval that isn't localised, but in a dynamic way affects one's world, a whole system that one takes for granted. When I received the knowledge of my mother's death, the wrenching character of that knowledge comes in part from the fact that it violently tears the fabric of hope, planning, and expectation that I've built up around her all my life. But when the knowledge of her death has been with me for a time, I reorganise my other beliefs about the present and future to accord with it. So what does this fabric consist of? Well, I don't think it can be principally propositional or linguistic in nature. Or if you want to call everything propositional, you better start distinguishing between A propositional and B propositional or something. There are things going on here that are different in kind. And as the quotation from Oates makes very salient, I think, this is something, what is affected, what is disturbed, disrupted, is something that's more usually presupposed by practically engaged linguistic thought and associated activities. So the emotional recognition that a particular person has died occurs within a world that incorporates all sorts of interconnected habitual routines, patterns of thought. But all of this, for some people, well, all of this depends for its intelligibility on variably integrated cares, commitments, concerns, values. And for some people, the majority of these cares and concerns implicate another person in one or another way. I do these things for her. I look forward to coming home where she'll greet me. We do this together in order to actualise something that we care about. We can achieve these things together. I cook dinner for us. Dinner's something that we eat together. You can go on and on. So you can understand this disruption of a world in terms of the loss of intelligibility of certain practices that depend on concerns that implicate the deceased and therefore no longer make sense. But the tension arises because all of this doesn't happen instantaneously. It's not that you just recognise that somebody's died and therefore you instantly update all your concerns. There's a tension between a world that endures and the fact that that world can't endure. And with that in mind, let's look at this example of home again. What's going on there? I don't really do philosophy of language, and I think I probably need help from a philosopher of language at some point. But one of the things that we should consider is when, I doubt we can come up with a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for something qualifying as home. And I also think that if someone tries to do that, they should maybe reconsider their profession. But home at least has certain connotations. When one uses the term home, my home, they're thinking of familiarity, safety, security, comfort, privacy, family. So if you want to, you could formulate a generic statement such as home, as usually thought of, includes properties X, Y, and Z. And you can do this in a generic way where those properties don't relate to anyone in particular. But when I talk about my home, it's always self-referential in a certain way. These properties have a more specific form. It's the security of returning to a particular person, the familiarity of certain concrete routines that are specific to me. So when I say my home, I'm not just talking about X in a generic way. For me, it's something specific. It's A, it's B, and it's C. So sometimes when the term home is used, it has a self-referential aspect. And what I'm getting at isn't always the case. If you're in a really, really boring social situation, you say, I've had enough of this, I'm just going home. You could preserve the meaning here by saying, I have had enough of this and I am therefore retiring to my private residence. It's indexical, but it doesn't have the same self-residential character. But sometimes when you say I'm going home, you mean something slightly different from that. I just want to be back home. All I want now is just to be at home. The connotations are different. And it's here that these tensions arise at the linguistic level between the fact of someone's death and the utterance, I'm going home. So again, certain experiences, thoughts and activities continue to presuppose a practically meaningful world. And this also goes for explicit linguistic expression. But it's not just linguistic. And this is a world that's sculpted by habitual concerns. But within that world, one registers the death of a particular person. The significance of what's happened undermines the very framework through which it's recognised as significant. And there's a clash where the two coexist awkwardly. It's not straightforward contradiction. In one sense it is. My partner has died and I need to withdraw to that safe place that I share with my partner. There's clearly something that's gone wrong there. But in various other cases, the utterance seems perfectly true. It's not simply that it's false or that it's self-contradictory, but there's a kind of tension there that can be exemplified by utterances like that. I'm going home to the place I share with my partner with the possessions of my dead partner. And I think this tension's experienced. And examples like this home case reflect that, make it explicit. And with this in mind, you can see how it's possible to say various things that seem self-contradictory, but make perfect sense. I'm going home now, although it's not a home really, not anymore. My home's not my home anymore. It means something. And this isn't limited. This is the interesting thing. It's not limited to explicitly indexical language. It's much more pervasive. This tension can pervade everything one says, thinks, perceives, and does. So, when I go back to Vienna, I might take a stroll in the park and I can say, Liechtenstein Park is nice. It is. It's a bit posh, but it's quite nice. And you might say, well, somebody else can utter that without falling prey to this kind of self-referentiality. But suppose that you've spent the last 40 years walking through Liechtenstein Park every Saturday with your partner, and then you utter, Liechtenstein Park is nice. You think, how can this be the same Liechtenstein Park after what's happened? It doesn't make sense. Even though Liechtenstein Park isn't like home, it's not explicitly indexical. This self-referential aspect is still there, and it's often hidden from explicit propositional language. But there's a change in a kind of meaning. It's very difficult to diagnose it on the basis of propositional content alone. Something that's often missed, and something that is specific to certain kinds of emotional dynamic. So it's not that something is instantly lost from one's world. You get this tension because a profound change in how you habitually experience and engage with things can't occur instantaneously. Again, you might say it's propositional, but it's not like updating propositional beliefs. It's something that operates in a qualitatively different way. And I just take it to be a contingent truth of human psychology that we can't do instant updates in this kind of situation. And what you have during an emotional process, when you have these tensions between the focus and the target, the world and the object, there's a kind of incomprehensibility in extreme cases, at least a kind of tension. Sometimes something unfathomable. And one of my favourite examples of this, horrifying though it is from Shakespeare's Othello. And of course this isn't simply grief. He's just been duped into murdering his wife. So what he's feeling is a good deal more complicated, I would imagine. But what you see here is this dawning. You see the tension, and then you see a kind of sinking in. I evaluate what I've done in the context of this world. And then I recognise that that evaluation renders the very world in which it occurs unsustainable. But the great thing about being Shakespeare and doing it on stage is you can do it all super quickly. Something that takes a very long time is illustrated, I think, beautifully by this quotation. So he's just murdered Desdemona. It says, if she come in, she'll sure speak to my wife. My wife, my wife. What wife? I have no wife. So he just takes for granted that he has a wife. Not a series of interconnected propositions concerning being married to Desdemona. One might say rather that his whole world, everything he thinks, follows paths that presuppose Desdemona's possible presence. His world is imbued with the potential presence of Desdemona. Its integrity, the way it hangs together, presupposes his marriage. And in the context of that world that stays intact, he's killed his wife. There's a kind of senselessness, a kind of meaning loss, a breakdown of something that's more usually taken for granted. And there you see it, oh insupportable, oh heavy hour. Methinks it should be now a huge eclipse of sun and moon, and that the affrighted globe should yawn at alteration. So what he's done ripples to render unintelligible the context in which he's done it. And for Shakespeare it happens quickly, but this can be a long, multifaceted process. And one of the things that interests me most about these kinds of cases is that there is, in the case of especially profound emotional upheaval, of the kind that demands radical revision of entrenched practice, one is confronted with the inadequacy of practically oriented rational thought. This isn't the old point that emotions can be irrational. It's not the emotion here that's irrational. What we find is that ordinarily our thinking, our practice, presupposes various relations of practical implication. If I do this, then this will be achieved, contributing to that. If I do P, then Q, thus furthering the aim of R. But these relations, to varying degrees, cease to apply. So, as in the case of home, one's sense of home has changed. And the relationships between concepts are not the same as they were. Inference patterns break down. In the context of one's practically engaged reasoning, the steps of one's reasoning, the chains of reasoning one goes through, presuppose these patterns, these trails through the forest. When the trails are there, relationships of implication don't hold anymore. There's a peculiar lack of grounding. So the relations between P and Q that one's reasoning ordinarily presupposes, takes for granted, those relations depend on circumstances particular to one's life. And without those circumstances, you can't mean the same things anymore. They don't hang together the same way. And then thinking about Wittgenstein, sort of, but I don't want to mention Wittgenstein, so just pretend I didn't, because otherwise some Wittgenstein scholar will totally hammer me. But anyway, when these relationships cease to hold, you've got this profound, distinctive sense of uncertainty. Nothing specifies how to go forward, what to do. The pathways aren't there anymore. They've gone. It's just the undergrowth. It is analogous to saying 1, 2, 3, 4, and then being confronted by the strange reality that nothing dictates what comes next. The rules don't apply anymore. And this isn't about emotional irrationality. I think it's an inevitable consequence of structuring one's relationship with a changeable world through a set of concerns that are more intricate and stable. The two can come apart, such that one's concerns no longer apply, they no longer make sense. So it's not a kind of emotional irrationality at least in any familiar sense. And I think Kim McLaren picks up on this in a paper she wrote on authentic emotions, where she says in profound grief, we don't find the reiterations and recapitulations of old sedimented meanings. There's a genuine openness, a peculiar kind of openness. The bereaved isn't simply asking an isolated question. Its life has become a question. And I think when we look at these cases, what we see is something that's going on more pervasively, but in a much more subtle way. There's something that linguistic thoughts and mundane experiences presuppose, but it's forever in flux. There's a kind of indeterminacy to the taken for granted world. Varies in subtle ways, but sometimes dramatically. So I think what singles out emotional intentionality, in contrast to believing that P and perceiving that Q, is that it has this two-sided structure in contrast to other intentional attitudes that are operating within a pre-made world. And there are all sorts of contexts when we see this. A good research tool is Google. If you go onto Google and just type, "I can't believe this is real" or whatever, you'll find all sorts of things. So these are just condensed versions of things that you'll find a lot on Google at the moment, where you have a tension between a certain evaluation and it's just not making sense. This can't be happening. There's a clash between the evaluation and a world that still stands fast, even though it can't. I can't believe that Donald Trump's president. I know it, but it isn't integrated into the world. There's a tension between a world I still inhabit and can't let go, and the fact this guy's in the White House. And of course, I can't believe that someone's died. Another very popular one, I can't believe they voted for Brexit. Or, oh, I can't believe we've got our country back, depending on which one you read. The more negative ones are much more prevalent. I can't believe I've won the lottery. It's not so common. Couldn't believe what I was seeing. You find a lot of that. And then you find a lot of statements to the effect, I know it's true, but I still can't believe it. Now, if you're going to apply this more generally, all sorts of further distinctions need to be drawn. We need to distinguish less profound cases and more localized cases. Also, disturbance has rather negative connotations, but also positive life events can involve perturbations of a world that we took for granted. We can also distinguish between emotions that involve the potential disturbance of a world and emotions that involve the actual disturbance. But in fact, that distinction isn't as clear as, say, an epistemic factive distinction, because a potential disturbance can also alter one's world in just as sure way as an actual disturbance. If somebody tells you they're going to build a gigantic aircraft runway right next to your beloved farmhouse, the very possibility of this happening, even though it hasn't, will unsettle things, will affect what is actually the case. And we need to make all sorts of other distinctions. Sometimes this involves relief from another emotional predicament. We need to think of this in complicated ways. One inhabits a kind of emotional turbulence, then things are somehow resolved satisfactorily. But again, even in these cases where an emotion involves relief, resolution and calm, you find this sort of discourse. I can't believe I don't have to worry about it anymore. I'm going to have to pinch myself to convince myself it's real. So it's something we see a lot, but something I believe has been under-theorized. And I want to add a further thesis, which I'm not going to argue for. I just hope you'll go, oh yeah, that sounds really intuitive, and let me get away with it. Which is that emotions aren't just regulated. Emotional processes, when they operate well, are themselves regulative processes. The emotion doesn't disrupt. An emotional process is a way in which the disruption of the habitual world is acknowledged and then negotiated. So I'm increasingly thinking of emotion as something that maintains and actively revises and repairs the world that we find ourselves in. a kind of intentionality that is therefore quite different from what philosophers would describe in terms perhaps of perceiving that P, remembering that Q, or believing that R. So they're integral to a broader rationality, to maintaining the world within which we think, at least when they don't go awry. I'll just offer a couple of final thoughts now. I mean, where I haven't said that feelings and judgments are exactly the same thing, I've always been much more into feelings. So you might say, surely what I'm proposing now is much more cognitive. What you have is an emotional evaluation that says there's more to come. This evaluation implies the destruction of a whole host of habitual assumptions that you still take for granted. This is going to percolate into your world and involve a gradual updating process with all sorts of conflict upon the way. So surely this involves a temporarily drawn-out string of judgments and beliefs and updates and the like. But in fact, I think a lot of the work can be done by feeling. You might say that a feeling can't point beyond itself. Surely a feeling can't include a sense of its own inadequacy. A feeling can't say, this evaluation is not adequate, it's not complete, this is going to ripple through your world. Well, I think it probably can. And I won't again offer an argument, I'll just make a suggestion. And I was going to say some things about emotional depth or embarrassment. But I'm going to skip that just because of lack of time. But I've also been exploring emotional depth or emotional profundity in this context. But sometimes you have, or embarrassment again, sometimes, not always, but sometimes the initial emotional evaluation involves a sense there's more to come. This is going to send shockwaves through my world. Doesn't always, but the initial evaluation could say, I'm not adequate yet because the world in which I'm occurring is set for dramatic revision or collapse. And in short, I just think we should start thinking of feelings themselves in a more dynamic way. Feelings can involve a kind of non-propositional anticipation. If we allow that there are world-directed feelings, I want to suggest that the same feeling can be directed at a localized object of emotion and point towards the structure of one's life. So feelings aren't synchronic qualia. The kind of feelings I'm interested in have an anticipatory structure. They can point to something. And the point to recognize is the emotion needn't embody the feeling needn't embody the full anticipated content, a full cognitive recognition of what's coming, an inventory of all the aspects of one's life that now need to be reconfigured. It doesn't spell out the nature of one's journey into indeterminacy and uncertainty, but it doesn't need to operate as a map or a full descriptive manual. The feeling can just be a sign. It can point towards something in a way that is inchoate to some extent. What I currently feel isn't fully captured by the content of a given moment. A feeling of depth, of import, of profundity is the signalling of a route. It's a sign towards something rather than a map of it, a sign that can be more or less accurate. So one analogy would be tip of the tongue phenomena. You say, yes, that's it. And when you do recall the name, you can say, yes, that's what I was searching for. But I think on a plausible interpretation, the full content wasn't there beforehand. It's just that what comes next accords with a less specific anticipation. Or if you don't like that one, picture listening to a melody that you've never heard before. Even though you've never heard it before, you have a vague anticipation of what's coming next. So when it goes da 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 da, there's a sense of surprise or discordance or anomaly. And I think the feeling is like this. It points in an inchoate way to a certain route. Think of a feeling of impending doom, which again relates to the Trump stuff I put up earlier, I suppose. So I think there can be, even though it's not, there's a lot more going on, I think there can be a felt sense of what's to come, which is variably specific, a broad sense of the way things are going to unfold. So we can attribute quite a lot to feeling. We needn't have recourse to a whacking great edifice of judgments. Okay, I mean, how far does this kind of account go? What kind of phenomena does it apply to? Well, I'm reserving it for emotional ruptures involving actual or anticipated scenarios. And I think this is largely consistent with everyday talk of strong, occurrent emotions. And I think what we get here is, hopefully, a vaguely interesting philosophical conclusion, where even if we restrict ourselves to a phenomenological characterization of intentionality, forget all that dodgy teleosemantic stuff and everything else you might have read, we're only concerned with intentionality phenomenologically construed. Even then, I think there's an important distinction between kinds of intentionality. Some kinds of intentional experience arise within a pre-given world, whereas others call that world into question. And if you mess them up, you get all confused. So I think emotional intentionality is integral to something that other kinds of intentionality depend upon, take for granted for their very intelligibility. And here I need to do more work, I think, but to put it in a vague but not completely vague way, hopefully, it's not a modality of experience that exists alongside them. It's not a sui generis mode of intentionality riding alongside perception and memory and belief and the like. And it's not simply a form of perception or something either. Rather, it straddles the boundaries between familiar categories of intentionality. It's something that our thoughts, perceptions, memories and imaginings are imbued with for the simple reason that they all occur within the context of a world that has been put into question. Grief, for instance, infects all of them. Does this allow us to give a unitary account of human emotion? Of course not. And there's absolutely no prospect whatsoever of that because there's no agreed inventory of emotions, and there are all sorts of conflicting conceptions of emotion in different concepts of thought and practice. Nevertheless, I think this gets at something that is absolutely central and distinctive of a core group of emotional phenomena, certain paradigm cases of strong or deep emotions, if you like. And perhaps we could say the same structure is there in more subtle cases. It's just not as salient. What we can make explicit in relation to grief, we can find in more mundane cases as well. And also, something else I'm thinking about is that various emotions that depart from this, that don't quite add up, are precisely the ones that tend to be described in terms such as shallow, not genuine, or inauthentic, or construed as deficient in some other respect. So perhaps we can think of them in normative terms as deviations from this, as impoverishment of it. Of course, there'll still be all sorts of exceptions. I can't apply this to enduring, consistent attitudes of love and hate, don't think. Doesn't really work for ongoing enjoyment of a fairly mundane, meaningless pastime. And then there are all these things that people refer to as moods, habits, temperaments, character traits, background feelings. Also doesn't apply to what I've called existential feeling in previous work, but it's consistent with it, promise. But the point I've tried to make isn't so much about how we should categorize things for one purpose or another. Rather, what I've tried to do is make explicit a certain distinctive type of intentionality that is sometimes at work in affective experience, a two-sided dynamic structure that's fraught with tension. And this is an aspect of emotion that is often neglected, missed, or at least mischaracterized, I believe. And I also believe that it's far more revealing of the nature of emotion than simple appeals to any combination of judgments, feelings, perceptions, and the like. So I will stop there. Thanks.